Car companies have offered many crazy options over the years, but in the 1960s, there were quite a few funky options that were being offered, and Chrysler certainly had its share of funkiness when it came to these options. But one of the most strange and I think also cool options that was ever placed in a vehicle was available for only 2 years on Imperial vehicles, not Chrysler Imperial, but just Imperial vehicles for 1967 and 1968, the final 2 years before the Imperial would transition to the new fuselage body style in 1969. And that is the so-called Imperial Mobile Director option. Now, Chrysler during this time frame, unlike some of the other auto companies, for whatever reason, had this infatuation with dictaphones that were optional and you could get on your Chrysler, Imperial, even your Plymouth, you could get a dictaphone, or Dodge. And consequently, I guess they thought it was popular and that the customers enjoyed options that allowed them to, in effect, execute things that they would normally do at the office in their car. And so the Mobile Director option was kind of the pinnacle of this because it came with a fair amount of content that allowed you to use your car as an office. Now, as I said, it was only available for 1967 and 1968, and it was only available on Imperial coupes. You could not get it on the four-doors. And so it's a bit limiting in that regard, but what was the idea? Well, take a look here, and let's step into this particular 1967 Imperial coupe with the Mobile Director option. Now, you can see that the option came with a couple of features, and these are all stock. The first is that passenger seat that swivels around 180 degrees. Now, this was probably a good idea if you were stationary, but I can't imagine this being a good idea if someone were driving the car. I don't know about anybody else, but I would definitely get motion sickness if I were facing rearward while the car was driving. I never liked rear-facing station wagon seats for that reason. Then the second piece was that tabletop that you see there, upon which a yellow typewriter is perched. And that basically unfolded, and when it was stored, became the armrest for the front two passengers. So I'll show a picture of that in its various forms, but it basically was the armrest for the front passengers, and then it rotated and then unfolded to complete the tabletop that you see there. And then there was also a lamp. That was part of the factory option. So you had the lamp, you had the tabletop, you had the 180-degree swivel chair. Those were the main components of the Mobile Director option. And here's another view so you can see the seat. And notice the underside of the panel that's in the foreground there. It's padded because that's the portion that would actually form the center armrest. So that portion was padded. The other portion just folds out from there. Now, the Mobile Director option was extremely expensive. It was $597 in 1967. I believe the price was reduced to around $320 in 1968. Perhaps Chrysler was trying to sell more of these, but regardless, they just did not sell well. They were very, very rare. I would guess that only in the hundreds were made, maybe even under, let's say, 200. I don't know what exact figures are, but they are very, very rare and still so cool. Now, why was this so rare? Of course, the price was one factor, but another reason behind that is, the idea here was that an executive team could really sit and work together while they were in the car. And who's going to buy a two-door Imperial as an executive car and to sit in the back seat? It just doesn't work. You would think that if they made this an option on the four-door cars, it at least had a chance. But making it an option on the two-door cars and making it so expensive, I just don't think that it really ever stood a chance at commercial success and was a failure. And here, by the way, is a picture of the 1968 Imperial Mobile Director option, and it's very similar. You can see it has all the same componentry. This one doesn't have the light plugged in, but the armrest that folds into a table is the exact same. The seat stitch pattern's a little different, but aside from that and the lower price, it's effectively the same as the 1967 model. So where in the world did Chrysler come up with this idea for the Mobile Director? Well, let's go back to 1966, 1 year prior. And Chrysler released this 300X concept car. It was based on a 1966 Chrysler 300, which was, let's call it standard enough. But the interior was totally different. Now, you'll notice here the passenger seat has been rotated in the rear-facing direction, just like the Mobile Director. And while there wasn't a table, there was a television set in the rear that you could see the individual could watch here if they wanted. So it had some interesting features similar to the Mobile Director, and it had a lot of other things too. Notice the steering wheel here is almost like a Knight Rider-esque wheel with two handle grips that you would grip. And I'll zoom in now on the instrument cluster. And clearly this wasn't functional, it was just a mock-up, but you can see the transmission shift buttons there on the steering wheel, warning lights. You allegedly had cameras to see the rear of the vehicle. That's what that is off to the top right there. It's like a rear view camera. And then to the top left, you have the speedometer, which presumably would have been kind of a rolling drum style if it had been functional, in addition to the various idiot lights that are included around it in the event the car had a problem. And here's how you would drive the car. Notice the individual is gripping those Knight Rider-esque controls on the steering wheel. I hope this has a very fast power steering ratio because you're not making it more than 90 degrees really, maybe 100 degrees in either direction before your arms can't really do much. And I don't know how the steering wheel would wind back to center or return back to center without a bit of drama for the driver. But this was a telescoping wheel. Notice the bellows there that kind of covered up the mechanism to extend this fore and aft. Overall, an interesting idea and a predecessor to, as I mentioned, the Mobile Director for the 1967 model year. And that's the story of the Mobile Director option for Imperial for 1967 and 1968. Now, the 1967 Imperial was also new in a number of respects. This was the first unibody Imperial that had ever been produced. 1966 was the last year of the body-on-frame construction style for the Imperial. The other Chrysler makes, Plymouth, Dodge, and Chrysler itself, had already transitioned to unibody years before this, but Imperial held on to that body-on-frame construction through the 1966 model year. And like I said, 1967 would be the first, and Imperial would never again be body-on-frame. The 67 Imperial is also a pretty conservatively styled car. You'll notice that it, in some ways, looks very Ford-like with these flat fenders and flat quarters and a quite high roof. You had a lot of room inside for a hat. But I have to wonder if part of this was because Chrysler's chief stylist during this time frame, named Elwood Engel, came from Ford and joined Chrysler and began working on the 1963 model year cars and continued working on Chrysler cars all the way through the latter part of the 1970s. And Engel had been a design leader at Ford when the 1961 Continental came out. And you could certainly see some of that 61 Continental's influence in this 67 Imperial. And while the car is conservatively styled, there are a number of elements that I like about it. Those parking lamps there that are incorporated into the fender with the little Imperial Eagle detail, I think, are a nice touch. And notice how you have the flat fender, then you have this trough in between the fender and the main form of the hood. We'll see as we rotate around back that there's a great design symmetry about this car front to back. You could also see the front to back symmetry in the rake of the windshield versus the backlight. This was something that, Ford would really try to do, I would say, later on as well, on the 80s era town car even. But this car has a lot of those symmetrical elements front to back. Before we rotate around to the rear, also notice this kind of wall-to-wall grille with the Imperial name spelled out in block lettering, trying to emphasize the horizontal nature of the car despite the vertical kind of bladed fenders. And as we rotate to the rear, notice you've got the flat quarters. You have that trough in between the quarter and the main form of the trunk. So that form within a form, if you will, the trunk encapsulated by the quarters, the vertical nature of the quarters themselves, here accentuated by the bumper or these, bumper forms that were supposed to protect you in the event that you were reversing and hit something. And of course, you have the wall-to-wall nature of the tail lamp out back and a nice detail, that circular area in the middle with the Imperial logo. And like I said, you notice again the symmetry of the rake of the front windshield and the rake of the backlight, although the backlight here is also almost similarly large to the windshield. It doesn't really have any portion that's framed in or Frenched in like later Imperials. It's just a wide open backlight. So it just adds to that illusion of symmetry. The only thing they needed was to have rear vent windows on this car like the Fleetwoods of the era, and then it really would have looked symmetric. You could almost have this car driving in reverse and think that it might be the front. It's hard to discern what is the front and what is the rear overall. Now, under hood for the Imperial for 1967, you got Chrysler's 440 cubic inch V8. That came standard. This wasn't the high output 440, but it did make 350 gross horsepower, plenty of pep to propel the Imperial down the roadway. And of course, you can see here you got the Chrysler AirTemp air conditioning system with the V-twin 2-piston compressor, which also worked extremely well. The air conditioning systems in these cars generally were quite good. I would say they're not quite as good as the GM systems, but still they were icy cold for the era. You'll notice that this car also has cruise control. That's that big box mounted on the inner fender well there of the driver's side. And, of course, a dual-chamber master cylinder. This was the first year where the dual-chamber master cylinder was mandatory across all vehicles. They all had to have it in 1967. And interestingly, you get these kind of dainty braces from the firewall to the fender, I guess to help control the overall body twisting and torquing. I don't know if they worked, but I guess they had to work in order for Chrysler to put them there. And torsion bar hood springs, because, of course, Chrysler loved torsion bars during this era. They had introduced the Torsionaire Ride in 1957, and they were using them everywhere, including, as I said here, to keep your hood open. So Chrysler had this infatuation with torsion bars for the time frame. Kind of an interesting tidbit. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the Imperial Mobile Director, a very unique option for the 1967 and 1968 model years in Imperial coupes only. Thanks again for watching. What do you think of it? Would you have bought one? Would you have paid that $500+ in 1967, the equivalent of probably about $4,000 today? It's a hefty sum. Let me know in the comment section. Thanks again.